Good afternoon, students. Today is Wednesday, 22 September 2021. This lecture for today is one day late. I'm running a day late this week, which means that tomorrow's lecture will be posted on Friday, and we should be back on track by next week. Next week, as you know, we pause for our first exam on Tuesday, and that means we'll get back to lecturing on Thursday. And I'm planning on posting the video for Thursday's class on Wednesday. And then on Thursday, when we come in, we will be having a discussion. So let me talk a little bit about that. I know that in the letter I sent out, I said that all I would be doing in the classroom is playing the video that I had recorded the previous day. But after yesterday, a few students showed up. I think by the end of the class period, we had 10 or 12 students in the classroom out of 22. I decided that maybe we should have a discussion in the classroom instead of playing the video. So why don't we try that? Everyone, of course, is welcome to come to class. If you prefer to stay home and watch the videos that I post, that's fine. I will test you on the videos, the readings, and the postings, the Canvas postings. But the discussions will be about the topics that we're discussing. So, for example, we're currently discussing William Rowe's famous essay from 1979. Tomorrow in the classroom, we will discuss that essay, and particularly the part of it that I'll be lecturing on today. So let's try that and see how that goes. I really never liked the idea of playing videos in the classroom. As you know, I need to record my videos for the students who are sick or who may become sick, or who are showing symptoms and don't want to come to class and risk infecting others. So I really do need to continue recording and posting videos for at least the near future, maybe the whole semester. And that means, since I don't plan on lecturing on the same material twice, I had to decide what to do when I come to class. The university wants us to come to class, right? They don't want a purely online course. So if I'm coming to class and I'm not doing the lecture all over again that's already posted, the question becomes what to do. And as you know, I was thinking of playing the video in class, but now I think it's best if we have discussions. Now, maybe the discussions will peter out. Maybe no one will want to talk or discuss the issues. And if that happens, then I will go back and resume playing the video in the classroom. Actually, I have never done that yet, but we could start doing that. So here's what I propose. I'm going to draft, I think, 5 discussion questions for each of the 2 days we meet in the classroom. And I haven't decided how I'll make them available to you. I could either email them to you as soon as they're done, so that by the time you get to the classroom, you've had a chance to read and think about them. Or I could post them on Canvas, or both. I suppose I could just come to class and raise the discussion questions with you. The problem with that is you wouldn't have had time to think about them. So I prefer to get them posted or emailed to you before we meet, so you have some time to think about them and what you'd like to say. Now, what else? Here's another problem. Should I test you on things that come up during the discussion? I want to keep the discussions focused on the readings. For students who choose not to come to class, it might be thought unfair to have exam questions based upon the discussions that we have in the classroom. So I tell you what, I will make sure that my exam questions come from the readings, which all of you have available and all of you are required to read, the video lectures, which are available to all of you, and the handouts that I post on Canvas. In other words, if something comes up in the discussion during class, on Tuesday or Thursday, I will not put that on the exam if something new comes up. Obviously, if we're discussing something in our discussion that's in the reading or in my video or in one of my Canvas posts, obviously that's fair game, and I may test you on that. So if you choose not to come to class, the discussions that we have in class shouldn't affect your performance on the exam. I'll try to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay, I know it's all very complicated. I'm kind of winging it. We're trying to figure things out as we go. So tomorrow, later today, once this recording is done, I will post it and send you an email notifying you that the video is ready. Make sure you watch this video before you come to class tomorrow. If you choose to come to class tomorrow, we will have a discussion. I will have some questions for you, some discussion questions, and we will spend our time, or at least some of it, going over those. I think it'll be enjoyable for you, but we'll have to wait and see. I don't want it to become a bullshit session. You may have noticed that I posted a famous essay on Canvas for you. It's optional reading. The title is On Bullshit, and it's by a very famous philosopher named Harry Frankfurt. He published an article entitled On Bullshit many years ago, and it's become quite famous. Many people think it was written tongue-in-cheek. Maybe so, but I think there's a lot of serious content to it. Frankfurt is trying to analyze the concept of bullshit and ultimately try to formulate a theory about what it is and why there's so much of it, he says. So you may want to read that. It's optional, and that means I won't test you on it. I had another comment about the discussions. Oh, I don't want to lead the discussions. It would quickly turn into a lecture where students are sitting and listening to me. The purpose of it is to get everyone involved and have a lively exchange of ideas. So I'm not going to just sit in the corner and read something or just watch and listen to what's happening. I will be a participant in the discussions, but my role will be no greater than any student's role. I may step in from time to time to clarify something or ask a question. I may try to steer the discussion in a certain direction, that sort of thing. So I'll be a participant, but I don't want to take charge. It's meant to be a student-run discussion, primarily. Okay, today we're going to discuss part 2 of Rowe's essay. We didn't finish part 1 yet, so we need to spend the first few minutes finishing that. And then we'll move on to part 2. And when I lecture for you again on Friday, to complete the discussion of Rowe, I'll finish up with part 3. So make sure you not only have read all of Rowe before you watch my video Friday, but certainly make sure you watch the video and read all of Rowe before the exam on Tuesday. Now the exam, I told you I'd say more about it as we go along. The exam is Tuesday, the 28th of September, 6 days from today. You will have a 12-hour period in which to take it. You'll have from 8 in the morning until 8 in the evening. When you start the exam, you will have 75 minutes to finish it. So make sure when you start that you're ready to go, ready to finish. And you should look for your score. I haven't taken an exam myself on Canvas, so I don't know exactly what you see, but I'm told by other students that as soon as you finish, it tells you your score. So make a note of it so you don't have to write to me and ask. I, of course, have access to all the scores when all of the students are finished taking it. I will compile some statistics for you and present them to you probably in one of my videos so that all of you can see them. I'll have average score, score distribution, things like that for your own purposes. Okay, I think I've covered all the things, the preliminary matters. So let's get back to Rowe, and we'll pick up with part 1. Now, we left off, notice part one is where Rowe formulates his argument, which has become quite famous. And just a quick review, my simplification of Rowe's argument goes like this. I'm going to put the premises in the same order he has them in. Premise number one, although he doesn't put it this way, I think this is the point he's making. Premise number one of Rowe's argument is that pointless evil exists. Now remember what pointless evil is. It's not just any old evil. It's a particular subset of evil. It's evil for which there's no point or purpose. It's kind of meaningless evil. In everyday life, we sometimes submit to evils for the sake of some greater good. We go to the dentist knowing that it's going to cause pain, and we do that because in the long run, we will have better dental health and less pain. So sometimes a little bit of evil is justifiable as a means to a greater good or as a part of a greater good. So pointless evil is evil that is not part of any greater good. It's evil that doesn't serve as a means to any greater good. And surely, if there is a God who is all-powerful and perfectly good, there would be no pointless evil in the world. There might be some evil that has a point to it. A good God, a good and all-powerful God, would have a reason to allow evil if there's a point to it, if it produces a greater good, for example. But surely, Rowe claims, God would never allow any pointless evil. So that's his first premise. Pointless evil exists. His second premise, he thinks, will be accepted by everyone, not just his fellow atheists, but also theists, that is, people who believe in a personal God. And the second premise says, if you look at page 3 of my lecture notes where I state his argument, the second premise says, God and pointless evil are logically incompatible. In other words, they can't both exist. There can't be both God and pointless evil in the world. Another way to think of that is in terms of an if-then sentence. If God exists, then pointless evil does not exist. So that's just another way to think of Rowe's second premise. It puts his premise into an if-then form. Now, what conclusion follows logically from those two premises? The conclusion is that God does not exist. It makes sense, doesn't it? The second premise says these two things cannot both exist. The first premise says this one does exist. It follows logically that this one doesn't. And you'll see in a few minutes when we get to the G.E. Moore shift that the theist takes that basic argument and turns it around on Rowe. But let's hold off on that. We're still not done with part one. Okay, now what does Rowe say in support of his first premise? Rowe believes that pointless evil exists, and he thinks it's reasonable to believe that. Why? Well, here is Rowe's support. I'm going to be reading a paragraph from page 337. It's the third page of Rowe's article, and it's a famous story. Rowe came up with this little story, and every philosopher now knows about it. If you mention to any philosopher the case of the fawn, almost every philosopher would know, oh, that's William Rowe's famous case. So let's read it because the details are important. Okay, here we go. Suppose in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn, which is a baby deer, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. So far as we can see, the fawn's intense suffering is pointless. And why? Here's the reason. For there does not appear to be any greater good such that the prevention of the fawn's suffering would require either the loss of that good or the occurrence of an evil equally bad or worse. Nor does there seem to be any equally bad or worse evil so connected to the fawn's suffering that it would have had to occur had the fawn's suffering been prevented. Could an omnipotent, omniscient being have prevented the fawn's apparently pointless suffering? Rowe says the answer is obvious, as even the theist will insist. An omnipotent, omniscient being could have easily prevented the fawn from being horribly burned, or, given the burning, could have spared the fawn the intense suffering by quickly ending its life, rather than allowing the fawn to lie in terrible agony for several days. Since the fawn's intense suffering was preventable, and so far as we can see, pointless, doesn't it appear that premise 1 of the argument is true? That there do exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Now that paragraph should end with a question mark. It's just a typo. So that's Rowe's famous fawn case. Now, I'm sure Rowe chose that example carefully. Notice that what we have here is an example of natural evil. It's not moral evil. It's not the kind of evil that humans do to each other or to animals by abusing their free will. This is an evil brought on by a natural occurrence, a forest fire, a lightning strike that caused a forest fire, and this animal, not a human being, was caught up in it, was horribly burned, and died a lingering death. So the free will defense, you would think, won't work here. Nobody can say of this fawn case that God allowed the evil to occur to allow humans to make better choices. It was an act of human free will over which God had no control. There's no issue of free will here. Fawns, deer generally, animals generally don't have free will. So this can't be justified as God allowing evil to promote a greater good, namely free will or freedom of the will, free choice. So Rowe chose an animal suffering rather than a human suffering. He made it a case of natural evil rather than what's called moral evil, where humans do bad things to one another. Now, what does Rowe say about this fawn case? Does he claim to have proved the truth of his first premise that pointless evil exists? The answer is no. He's emphatic about this. He says that he has not proved or established the truth of the premise. That's not his goal. Maybe he would say, I don't know how I would prove the premise that pointless evil exists. His goal, he says, is something weaker than that. He wants to say that it's reasonable to believe that pointless evil exists. Cases like this fawn, and by the way, this fawn case was made up. It's a hypothetical case. It's not real. But notice, it doesn't matter because there could well be cases like this in the actual real world. And I'm sure there have been. There are surely cases where animals suffer terribly before they succumb to whatever injury they've suffered and die. Death relieves the suffering. So I suppose Rowe could have waited around for an actual case. Maybe one day, if Rowe waited long enough, he would read about an animal who was discovered in the forest, terribly burned, still alive, and it was clear that the animal must have been burned several days before. That would be an actual case, and Rowe could have used that. But rather than wait around for an actual case to come up, Rowe decided, I'll just make one up. It'll be realistic, even if it's not real, and it'll serve my purposes. It'll be an example that we can discuss that supports the rationality of believing that there is pointless evil in the world. On page 337, Rowe writes, perhaps, for all we know, there is some familiar good outweighing the fawn's suffering, to which that suffering is connected in a way we do not see. Notice what Rowe is saying here. Rowe is saying, when I look at this case from every angle, I can't see any good that was produced by that fawn's terrible suffering. There's no free will at work here. No knowledge is gained by any human being. I just can't see any good that's produced. So why would God have allowed this when God could easily have prevented it? Doesn't that count against there being an all-powerful and all-good God, Rowe says. So Rowe's point is that if you think there's no greater good being produced by this evil, then to that extent you have reason to disbelieve in God. The stronger your reason for believing that there is pointless evil, the weaker is your reason for believing in the existence of God. That's one way to think of what Rowe is doing here. And Rowe thinks that he's produced a case where we have good reason to believe that there is pointless evil in the world. And there isn't just one case. There are many, many cases of apparently pointless evil in the world. There are cases where children suffer from terrible diseases. You can't say that these children deserve it. They've done nothing to deserve it. What greater good is being produced by making these poor children suffer? So there are children who suffer. There are animals all over the world every day who suffer, who are preyed upon and who are injured, and so on. There's a great deal of pointless evil in the world, Rowe thinks. So here's what he says on page 337. I'm now on page 4 of my lecture notes. Rowe asks the following question: is it reasonable to believe that there is some greater good so intimately connected to that suffering? And remember, not just in the fawn case, but in every case of suffering, that even an omnipotent, omniscient being could not have obtained that good without permitting that suffering or some evil at least as bad. What is Rowe's answer to his question? He gives it immediately. Surely the answer to this more general question must be no. So Rowe thinks that there's ample support for his first premise. He thinks it's reasonable for someone to believe it. It's rational. In fact, look at all the terms Rowe uses in his essay. I collected them. I went through on one of my readings of Rowe's essay. I looked specifically for language about reasonable belief and rational belief. And here's the list I came up with. Maybe I missed one or more, but there are at least 7. On page 335, Rowe uses the term rationally justify someone in being an atheist. Okay, rationally justify. Page 335 in a footnote, and also on page 338, Rowe used the phrase rational support for atheism. On page 336, he used the phrase rational grounds for accepting its premises, the premises of the argument. Page 337, Rowe uses the phrase rational grounds for believing premise 1 to be true. On pages 337 and 338, he uses the phrase rationally supported. On pages 337 and 338, he refers to a rational belief. And on those same pages, he uses the phrase reasonable to believe. So Rowe isn't trying to prove that there's pointless evil. And therefore, he's not trying to prove that God doesn't exist. Right? That has been attempted by others, by Mackey, for example. Rowe is changing the argument. He's coming up with a new argument from evil that shifts the focus from the truth of the proposition that God doesn't exist to the rational justifiability of the proposition, of belief in the proposition that God does not exist. So Rowe tried to bring epistemology into it. Epistemology is a fancy name for theory of knowledge. And in an epistemology course, you would study things like the justification for belief, the rationality of our beliefs, the truth of our beliefs. What is knowledge, for example? Plato argued many years ago, many centuries ago, that knowledge is justified, true belief. Okay, that's a classic understanding of knowledge. Many philosophers have called it into question since then. Some people say that while justified, true belief is necessary for knowledge, it's not sufficient. In other words, there's some fourth element missing, and philosophers have tried to supply that fourth element. Anyway, epistemology is about such things as the justification of our beliefs, the rationality of our beliefs. So Rowe has turned the argument from evil into an epistemological argument, where the central concept is rational justification for belief. So once again, Rowe is saying the following. A person would be rationally justified in believing that there is pointless evil in the world. Second premise, pointless evil is incompatible logically with the existence of God. Therefore, a person would be rationally justified in believing that there's no God. Notice, that's a weaker claim than saying God does not exist. Rowe does not claim to have proved it or established that. He's concerned with the epistemological claim about rational justification. So the way I like to put it is that Rowe, unlike Mackey made an argument, what's called the logical argument from evil, and I think it's best to describe what Rowe is doing as giving us an epistemic argument from evil. The word epistemic is related to epistemology. And Rowe has come up with a new kind of argument. It's similar to Mackey's famous argument, but also different. Now let's read what Rowe says in conclusion at the end of section 1. It's near the bottom of my page 4 of my lecture notes. This is from page 338 of Rowe. Returning now to our argument for atheism, we've seen that the second premise expresses a basic belief common to many theists and non-theists. We've also seen that our experience and knowledge of the variety and profusion of suffering in our world provides rational support for the first premise. Again, he doesn't claim that it proves the truth of the first premise. It just provides rational support. Seeing that the conclusion, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being, follows logically from these two premises, it does seem that we have rational support for atheism, that it is reasonable for us to believe that the theistic God does not exist. And the italics were in the original. So Rowe himself italicized the following words: rational support, and earlier also he italicized rational support. So he wants to emphasize that. Okay, so I'm done with section 1 now. We were supposed to complete it the other day, but part 1 is a little bit longer than the others, so it took, we didn't finish it. But now we're done with it. Let's move on to part 2. And again, when I lecture Friday, I'll cover part 3 and maybe say a few words about Rowe's follow-up article entitled Friendly Atheism Revisited. That's on the reading list, so make sure, and I've put it on Canvas, so make sure you've read that before we discuss it on Friday, before you watch my video posted on Friday. Okay, part 2. Take a deep breath. Let's see what Rowe says about part 2. Part 2 addresses a different but related question. Remember, Rowe's essay consists of his answers to 3 different but related questions. Here's the second question. How can the theist best defend his position against the argument for atheism based on the existence of evil. And he means here pointless evil, of course, because that's his argument. It may strike you as odd that Rowe would try to answer this question. Rowe is asking, what would I do if I were a theist? And remember, Rowe was a theist for part of his life before he abandoned it and became an atheist. So Rowe is interested in what the theist might say in response to his argument. And Rowe is trying to be charitable to the theist. Rowe wants to think up the strongest reply he can for the theist. What's the best reply that a theist can make to my argument? Rowe is now going to discuss 3 different replies that a theist might make to Rowe's argument. 2 of them he thinks are not going to succeed, but the third one he implies is successful. The third reply produces a standoff, or perhaps we could call it a deadlock. And he doesn't say anything further. He doesn't say, I think this theistic reply ultimately fails. He doesn't say that it ultimately succeeds. He discusses it, and then he just stops all of a sudden, leaving the reader to wonder what he thinks of it. And I think what Rowe thinks of it is, he thinks that there is a deadlock, that both theists and atheists have rational justification for their beliefs. And that is what he takes up in part 3 of his essay. So let's say a few words about the first 2 attempted replies by the theist. The first one Rowe calls the modest response. Now remember, Rowe is making a simple argument. It has 2 premises, 1 and 2. We'll call them premise 1 and premise 2. And those 2 premises work together to support proposition 3, which is Rowe's conclusion. The first reply by the theist addresses Rowe's first premise, the one that says pointless evil exists. And what the theist says is, Rowe, you have not provided adequate support for that premise of yours, that first premise. You have not given us, the theist, reason to believe that there's pointless evil in the world. So Rowe thinks that the theist might try that reply. The theist might say, Rowe hasn't gone far enough. He hasn't given an argument for there being pointless evil. Now, Rowe says in response to this reply that the theist has to do more than simply demand more argumentation from Rowe. The theist has to do more than tell Rowe, you haven't supported your first premise. And here's why. Rowe has made an argument. The conclusion of the argument is that there is no God. It's atheism. If the theist rejects the conclusion, the burden is on the theist to reject at least one of the premises, because it's a valid argument. The conclusion follows validly from the premises. So, if you reject the conclusion, as the theist obviously does, the theist has to argue that at least one of the 2 premises is false. And if the theist accepts Rowe's second premise, then the theist has only one thing to do, and that is reject the first premise. And if the theist rejects the first premise, the theist has the burden of explaining why it's false. Why is it false that pointless evil exists? In other words, the theist must prove that there's no pointless evil. Now, Rowe doesn't discuss this in this essay, but a debate emerged from this essay about Rowe's famous argument. And the debate goes something like this. People have wondered what could possibly support Rowe's first premise. What kind of argument might Rowe make to support his first premise that pointless evil exists? And maybe people have speculated maybe Rowe would argue like this. And I've got this on my page 5 of my lecture notes. Rowe might say the following: if there were a point to the fawn's suffering, then we would see it. Right? Not literally see it. Notice I've got quotation marks. If there were a point to the fawn's suffering, we would know what it is. We would see it. We would grasp it. But we don't. Rowe says he has studied the case of the fawn thoroughly, and he just can't come up with any point to the fawn's suffering. So once again, here's what Rowe might argue in support of his first premise. If there were a point to the fawn's suffering, then we would see it. Second premise, we don't see it. Therefore, there's no point to the fawn's suffering. That's an interesting argument, isn't it? But notice it relies on the premise, if there were a point, then we would see it. Isn't it open to the theist to deny that and say to Rowe, there could be a point and we might not see it. We might not see it even if there is a point to the suffering. So I thought of a couple of possibilities. Here they are in that same paragraph. Imagine somebody saying the following: if there were dogs in the garage, we would see them. It's right. Someone might say, if there were dogs in the garage, we would see them. We don't see them, therefore, there are no dogs in the garage. That seems like good reasoning, doesn't it? The first premise seems true. If there were any dogs in the garage, then we would see them. The second premise seems true because suppose we go look, we don't see any dogs in the garage. We conclude there aren't any dogs in the garage. So that looks like good reasoning. But the theist says, in response to Rowe's reasoning, maybe it's more like this, Rowe. If there were fleas in the garage, then we would see them. But we don't see the fleas in the garage, therefore there aren't any. The theist says the premise of that argument is false. It's false that if there were fleas in the garage, we would see them. Fleas are so small that they might be in the garage even though we don't see them. So maybe that's the case with the fawn's suffering. Rowe seems to think that if there was a point to the fawn's suffering, we would see it. The theist says, not so fast. Maybe the point is like the fleas. Maybe there's a point to the fawn's suffering even though we can't see it, even though we don't see it. So the discussion about Rowe's fawn case and pointless suffering has continued in the literature in that way. It leads to discussion of various principles, such as if such and such were there, then we would see it. Sometimes that's true, as in the case of dogs. Sometimes that's false, as in the case of fleas. Okay, let's move on to the second possible reply by the theist to Rowe's argument. This one Rowe calls the direct attack. Notice the first one he called the modest response. And in Rowe's view, it fails. He thinks that the burden is on the theist to disprove the first premise. It's not Rowe's burden to prove it or support it. The theist has to reject it. Why? Because the theist has rejected Rowe's conclusion. If you reject the conclusion of a valid argument, you have to reject at least one of its premises. Now, let's move on to the second reply, the direct attack. Rowe says the theist might try to prove directly that there's no pointless evil. And that would mean what? How do you prove that there's no pointless evil? That means for every alleged case of pointless evil, you have to show the point of that evil, either by describing some greater good, like free will, that God allows. If God wants free will, then God has to allow human beings to abuse that free will and produce evil. So one way for the theist to attack Rowe's first premise is to show that for every case of pointless evil, alleged pointless evil, there is a point, such as free will. Rowe thinks this strategy is doubtful. He says on pages 338, 339, it's doubtful that this can succeed, especially since theists believe that, quote, it is not given to us to know God's purpose in allowing particular instances of suffering. So many theists, as you know, believe that we can't know God's purposes. Some of them perhaps, but certainly not all of them. God is inscrutable. God is beyond our ken to some extent. We may know of the existence of God and the attributes of God, such as omnipotence, but we don't know the full details of God's plan for the universe and for humans and animals. So for all we know, there may be a point to the fawn's suffering. There may be a point for every instance of suffering in the world. And just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. One reason we can't see it is because God works in mysterious ways, the theist says. Right? God is beyond our ken, beyond our knowledge. So Rowe thinks this strategy is not likely to succeed. Right? There's simply too much evil for it to be reasonable to think that the theist can explain every one. And many theists say that we can't know God's plan and purposes anyway, which makes it even harder to prove that every instance of evil has a point. So let's turn now to the third and final theistic response to Rowe's argument. This is the one that Rowe thinks has a chance to succeed. It has a funny name. Rowe calls this strategy the G.E. Moore shift. Now, G.E. Moore was a famous British philosopher in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Actually, I think he lived well into the 20th century. G.E. Moore worked primarily in ethics, but also in metaphysics. And one of Moore's famous arguments had to do with skepticism. And Rowe discusses this briefly. But let me run it by you. The skeptic is someone who doubts that we can have knowledge or a certain type of knowledge. Some skeptics claim that we can't have knowledge of the external world, of the existence of material things, material objects, physical objects. And so skeptics have come up with a certain set of principles which they think are defensible. And the skeptic thinks that on these principles, it follows that we can't have knowledge of the external world. So that's a very skeptical position to take. So here is the argument of the skeptic, and you'll see what Moore said in reply to it. The skeptic says, my principles are correct, right? The skeptic's principles are correct ones. We don't need to know what those principles are for the moment. But the principles that the skeptic comes up with, the skeptic claims are correct. Premise number 2, by the way, I'm reading from page 6 of my notes now. Second premise, this is the skeptic's argument. If my principles are correct, then I cannot know of the existence of this pencil or any other physical object. This is a pen, but imagine it's a pencil. What follows from those premises? The first premise says, my principles are correct. The second premise says, if my principles are correct, then I can't know that a particular pencil exists. And the conclusion that follows from those premises is that I cannot know that a particular pencil exists. I cannot know of the existence of this pencil. So the skeptic is in the position of denying what many people take for granted, namely that we can know certain things about the world outside of us. I'm calling that the external world. Now, here's what G.E. Moore did. He was pretty witty in coming up with this. Moore realized that he could simply turn the argument around and use it against the skeptic. So Moore took the skeptic's conclusion and used its denial as his first premise. So here's Moore's first premise. I do know that this pencil exists. And Moore supposedly held up a pencil when he made this argument in a talk and said, I know that this pencil exists. The second premise is the same as the skeptic's argument. Namely, if the skeptic's principles are correct, then I cannot know of the existence of this pencil. What follows from those two premises? That the skeptic's principles, or at least one of them, is incorrect. So notice what Moore is doing. Moore has pointed out that there's an incompatibility between the skeptic's principles and knowledge that this pencil exists. And they can't both be true. The skeptic says my principles are true and infers that the pencil cannot be known to exist. Moore says, wait a minute, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to start with my knowledge of the pencil's existence. I'm going to use your same second premise, and I'm going to infer that your principles are incorrect. Now that's pretty nifty, isn't it? Moore turned the argument around, and you need to understand exactly what the G.E. Moore shift amounts to. In the argument, the skeptic's argument, you have the second premise is an if-then sentence. The first premise is the if part of the second premise. The conclusion is the then part of the second premise. Now, what did Moore do? Moore took the conclusion of the skeptic's argument, he negated it, and he made it his first premise. He kept the second premise the same. He negated the premise of the skeptic's argument and made it his conclusion. That's the G.E. Moore shift. The famous saying among philosophers is that one person's modus ponens is another person's modus tollens. And that's exactly what's going on here. The skeptic was making a modus ponens argument, and Moore made a modus tollens argument. Both of those argument forms are valid. If you've had logic, you know that. Modus ponens goes like this. Listen carefully now. If P, then Q. Second premise, P. Conclusion, Q. Right? That's modus ponens. The modus tollens goes like this. If P, then Q. Not Q, therefore not P. So Rowe realizes that this same strategy can be employed by the theist. So let's see how it works. Moore's argument, as you may have noticed, is modus ponens. Moore's argument has as its second premise, if God exists, then pointless evil does not exist. Rowe's argument is the modus tollens version. It's the theist who turns it around and makes it into modus ponens. Sorry about that. Let me go back and do it again. Rowe's argument is modus tollens. Here's how it goes. First premise. Now I'm going to reverse the order of his premises. I want the if-then sentence to come first. Rowe says, if God exists, then there is no pointless evil. Rowe's second premise denies the then part. How do you deny there is no pointless evil? You make it there is pointless evil. And that, of course, was Rowe's initial premise. Pointless evil exists. What follows from Rowe's premises? The negation of the first part, the if part of the if-then sentence, namely, God exists. So Rowe's conclusion is God exists. All right? So Rowe's argument is if God exists, then there's no pointless evil. I think I misspoke a moment ago. Let me do it again. If God exists, there's no pointless evil. Second premise, there is pointless evil. Conclusion, God does not exist. I think I said God exists a moment ago. That was wrong. Okay? Now, here's the G.E. Moore shift applied to Rowe's argument. The theist takes Rowe's conclusion, which is that God does not exist, and negates it and makes that the premise. So the premise of the theist's argument is God exists. That's the starting point. The theist then makes use of Rowe's if-then premise, Rowe's second premise. If God exists, then pointless evil does not exist. What follows from those premises by modus ponens? That pointless evil does not exist. So that argument is valid just as Rowe's argument is valid. They're both valid. What the theist has done is turned Rowe's argument on its head. Rowe had a modus tollens argument. The theist has the corresponding modus ponens argument. Now, Rowe doesn't really say anything about this strategy. He just leaves it there as though we've reached a deadlock or some kind of a stalemate. It would be like a draw in chess. A draw is where neither side wins. Now, Rowe may think there's some other argument in favor of the non-existence of God, but it seems as though he's saying the theist has an effective reply to my argument. And that leaves open the possibility that Rowe could write an article in the future saying more about it. But this is where he leaves it in this article. Okay, what else do I want to say? Oh, the last thing I want to do today is I was going to make a handout for you of this, but I think I'll hold it up close to the screen, and when you see it, you can pause your video and take a close look at it. So let me hold it up first of all. Just ignore, I made some notes over here during class yesterday, but I crossed them out. Okay, do you see that? It's in green ink, but I hope you can read it. Okay, now I'm going to read what I've written down. This is just a quick version to help you understand the G.E. Moore shift. Rowe thinks that almost everyone agrees with the following. The following two propositions are logically inconsistent, meaning they cannot both be true. And this is Rowe's second premise. What are the two propositions? Pointless evil exists and God exists. Rowe claims as his second premise that those two propositions are logically incompatible, logically inconsistent. And what that means is they cannot both be true. They might both be false, but they cannot both be true. Now think about that for a moment. When you say these two propositions cannot both be true, that means that if one of them is known to be true, the other one has to be false. And here is where Rowe and the theist go in different directions. So these two propositions that I put in a box can't both be true. So if one of them is true, the other one has to be false. Rowe says that the one that's true is pointless evil exists. And from that, he draws the conclusion that it's false that God exists. The theist goes the other direction. The theist says that the true one is that God exists, and since they can't both be true, it must be false that pointless evil exists. And that's what I've written down here. And it actually turns out to be a little bit weaker. Yes, it's true that if God exists, then pointless evil does not exist. But the theist doesn't claim to have proved that God exists. So all the theist will claim is that if it's reasonable to believe that God exists, then it's reasonable to believe that there is no pointless evil. Rowe, on the other hand, weakens his claim to the following. If it's reasonable to believe that there is pointless evil, then it's reasonable to believe that there's no God. Once again, we have a stalemate. Each of these arguments is valid. The conclusion follows logically from the premises. So Rowe would probably at this point ask the theist to prove or at least provide rational support for the existence of God. And the theist will be more than happy to do that. Remember, to the theist, using the G.E. Moore shift, the first premise is God exists. If Rowe said to the theist, support that, the theist would say, okay, I'm going to make a version of the ontological argument for the existence of God. I might also make a version of the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the moral argument, the argument from religious experience, and maybe some other ones. As you know, theists have made a number of arguments for the existence of God over the centuries, and there's still today much discussion of each of those arguments. Often when I teach this course, I devote it to the 3 or 4 most famous arguments. I chose to do things differently in this course. In fact, when we look at Richard Swinburne's book, we will be looking at his arguments for the existence of God. So if Rowe demanded that the theists support the premise that God exists, the theist would oblige. The theist would try to do so. The theist would throw it back at Rowe, though, and say, okay, if you're making us support our first premise that God exists, then we're going to make you support your first premise that pointless evil exists. And that may be difficult for Rowe to do. In fact, Rowe says he hasn't proved that pointless evil exists. The most he claims is that he's offered reasons to think that it is true that there's pointless evil. And that's where the Fawn case comes in. Okay, I think I've covered everything I want to cover. We're almost an hour into the lecture. When I lecture again on Friday, I will discuss part 3 of Rowe's essay, and also I'll probably have some time to discuss Rowe's article entitled Friendly Atheism Revisited. So make sure you read that. I think you'll find it interesting. It's mostly autobiographical. Rowe describes his journey from devout theist to famous atheist. Rowe, at one point in his life, devoted himself to God. He committed himself to his church, and he intended to become a pastor of some sort. All of that changed when he began to study philosophy, and eventually he became a self-conscious, self-described atheist. He always claimed to be a friendly atheist, however. And the article that I'm asking you to read, the second article by Rowe, is about his friendly atheism. Now, I want to make one more point before I close for today. In part 3 of the article we're now discussing, Rowe coins the term friendly atheist. In the second article, entitled Friendly Atheism Revisited, Rowe, I think, shifts the meaning of the term friendly atheist. It comes to mean something different. And Rowe doesn't seem to be aware that he has changed the meaning. A friendly atheist in this essay has to do with your position on the rationality of theistic belief. By the time he came to write the article, the second article, friendly atheism came to be a personal attitude toward theists. Are you friendly toward them? Do you like them? Now, Rowe, I think, is a friendly atheist in both senses. I think Rowe is a friendly atheist in this sense that we're going to be discussing Friday, and he's also friendly in the personal sense. Many of Rowe's best friends, you could say, are theists. He's co-authored books with theists and has friends who believe in God. So he's friendly in the personal sense as well. And as a final sub-question, could it be that Rowe is a friendly atheist in the personal sense because he's a friendly atheist in the epistemological sense? Rowe doesn't discuss that, but I have some thoughts about it. I think the answer is yes. I think that if you're a friendly atheist in the original epistemological sense, I think you're going to be more likely to be friendly toward theists in the other sense of the word or term. Okay, that's enough for today. 1 hour in. I'm going to get this posted today, which is Wednesday. Tomorrow, when we meet in the classroom, we will have a discussion about this lecture. I will formulate 5 questions and probably send them around by email. And then that'll give you a chance to think about them before tomorrow when we meet personally in the classroom. And then again, on Friday, I will post a video lecture like this one on part 3 of Rowe. And don't forget, the exam's coming up quickly, so don't put off your studying. Go back, start arranging your material, rereading parts of the readings, if not all of them, looking over my handouts, making sure you understand them, and going back and watching my videos, parts of them at least, for parts that are unclear, still unclear to you. So you've got a lot of work to do before Tuesday. Make sure you put in the work. There's nothing sadder to me than a good student who doesn't work hard enough on the first exam, gets a poor score, maybe in the 70s or 80s, and because of that poor score, is unable to get a good grade in the course. Your score on the first exam may be so poor that you cannot mathematically get an A in the course. And that's sad. I want you to do as well as you can on the first exam so that a good score, maybe a very good score, is still open to you so that you have reason to keep working hard. Okay, so there's my little pep talk. Good luck in your studying. Keep at it until the exam, and I think it'll pay off for you. All right, see you next time. See you tomorrow if you come to class. See you on the video if you don't.